here we go. Rabbi Jacob Fine is the director of Abundance Farm, and for 15 years he has worked and taught in the field of Jewish environmental and agricultural education. He's served as rabbi and educator for a number of leading Jewish environmental organizations, and he was ordained as a rabbi from the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and he also has an MA in Rabbinic Studies. He's a graduate of Vassar, where he has a BA in Environmental Studies and Religion. And Jacob is also a very close friend, I would say, and member of the Beth Shalom community. And we're just really delighted and excited to have him back to teach us. I think he's the absolute perfect person to give this hopefully very thought-provoking talk today. So without further ado, thank you for being here, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. I want to thank you, Deirdre, and Melanie for helping to make this whole series possible and having the vision and inspiration to bring Shmita ideas and values to the broader audience. And it's awesome. I love that you're doing this, and many folks are doing similar kinds of work around the country, and there's some momentum building. Cool. So as Deirdre mentioned, I feel close to the Beth Shalom community. I don't know how many of you are members of that community or affiliates, but I lived out there a bunch of years ago prior to moving back to this area in Western Mass. I'm in Northampton, Massachusetts, and very, very special community, and I miss it in lots of ways. So it's awesome to reconnect this way. So what I want to do is, there's a small enough group. I'd love to hear people's voices, and we don't have a lot of time. I don't want to take a long time here, but I just want everyone to be able to say hello. So if we could go around, I'll call names, I guess. When I call a name, and then you can call on the next person. And if you could just introduce yourself, just say your name. And I guess for the purposes of this, it would be helpful if you are a gardener, to mention that. And if not, that's good too, because I think the ideas that we'll be discussing, while they could have some literal application in a garden setting, there's also, in my mind, some pretty clear or interesting ways that the principles could be abstracted outside of an agricultural setting. So why don't you just say your name, and you could say where you're from, where you're living. All right, great. We'll start. Colin Garrett, what's up?
Hello, I'm Colin. We are Beth Shalom next, so we're calling in from the Seattle area, unceded Duwamish land, and I am a reluctant gardener by virtue of being a homeowner. But
I think that's fair, and my name is Garrett. Mimics my answer of I am not a gardener, I'm more of a front yard waterer.
But maybe we're on a journey.
All right, thank you. Call next, folks.
Jessica.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Zimmerly. I am the Program and Outreach Director at Earth Ministry in Washington Interfaith Power and Light, so one of the co-sponsors here on Duwamish land as well in North Seattle, and really excited to have a pea patch plot this year. So I've got a small space to work with, but way more than my balcony gardening endeavors to date.
Nice. I loved my pea patch while I was out there.
And I will invite Rabbi Zeri.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zeri Weiss, Rabbi Zeri Weiss, and I call myself an aspiring gardener. I have never been very successful, and this year I'm trying to do it better. And I hope that I will be able to enjoy the fruits of my labors. So how about Jennifer Nemhauser?
Hi, thanks. So I'm Jennifer Nemhauser, and I am also calling in from Seattle, where I knew Rabbi Jacob when he was at Hillel, and really appreciated that his time there. I am a plant biologist professionally at the University of Washington, and I try not to take my work home with me that much, but really love seeing everyone else's gardening efforts. So, oh, and I will call on Melanie Baker.
Hi, I'm Melanie, and I am not a gardener since I was like 10 years old helping my mom in the garden, but you never know what might happen. And I will pass it to Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie Bailey. Oh, I think I'm probably muted. Nope, I'm not. I'm Jackie Bailey. I am a gardener in that I buy the plants. I do garden, and I get a lot of, now you're supposed to be feeding your tomatoes, or it's time to do this for my girlfriend. So, and I thought I recognized Rabbi Fine, and I don't know if you were a JDS graduate? No.
I wasn't, but yeah, I worked at Hillel and J Connect, and then was just an active community member at Beth Shalom. Yeah.
Right. There are other Fines whose son actually became a rabbi as well. But anyway.
Right. Well, nice to see you, Jackie.
Good for some Yiddishkeit learning.
Yeah, all right.
Oh, who's Celio? You're muted, Celio.
Yes,
there.
that's okay. I'm Celio. I'm a Judaism student at Beth Shalom. Not a garden. I graduated as a dentist. So I just right here to learn with you more. And the little things I know get bigger and bigger, and more knowledge in Judaism life.
Great.
Right.
Nice to learn with you.
Thank you. I think Daisy here, Miss Kebai. I don't know who.
Oh yeah, hi. This is me. I'm Deirdre, and I love to garden. I'm in a shady spot right now, so I don't garden as much as I would like. But I have a friend who has invited me to garden at her pea patch, so I'm delighted with that.
Nice.
And I also help to manage the Beth Shalom garden, which is sort of, it's a big backyard with lots of plots, but I'm an assistant there.
Nice. All right. We'll keep going around here. I enjoy, you know, even though we don't have a lot of time, I think it's nice to hear everyone's voices here. Ronnie? We can't hear you, Ronnie.
I'm Ronnie. I help create a pea patch in my local park in Seattle. I've been involved with that program upwards of 20 years. And because of COVID last year, I neither gardened in the pea patch or on my deck. So I'm looking forward to getting the courage to go out and garden this year. I do buy my plants. I discovered growing starts inside, even with a grow light, didn't work when you put them outside, at least not for me. But love tomatoes, love leeks, lavender, lemon chives, rhubarb. That's my gardening.
Awesome. Thanks, Ronnie. Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Nathan. I haven't gardened in many years now. I grew up gardening with my mom, and then I had a garden a number of years ago. I heard about this through the Temple Sinai to Hirsch mailing list, and I was like, boy, this is more learning. This is awesome. Let's go. And now I'm here.
Glad you're here. Carrie? We haven't heard from you, have we?
No. I am not a gardener, but I'm kind of an aspiring gardener. But we travel a lot in the summer, and our past gardens have just shriveled up and died. And I'm sure we could have people come and water, but we just haven't done that. But I'm really interested in the concept of Shmita, and I am a member of Beth Shalom. So I've been listening to this series. I'm an artist, and the idea of Shmita shows up in some of my work.
Amazing. Awesome. Just try to go quickly here to get into our learning. So Nancy, have you had a chance to say hello?
Yeah, hi, I'm Nancy. I live on almost 8 acres in a rural area outside of Olympia. And I have a large flower garden and a vegetable garden that is part of my spiritual practice.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nancy. Molly?
Hi, I'm Molly. I am one of the rabbis at Temple B'nai Torah in Bellevue. I am an aspiring, mostly failing gardener at this point. And one of my favorite Hidden Brain episodes, I don't know if anyone listens to Hidden Brain, is the episode about if you're a gardener versus a carpenter. So philosophically, I'm a gardener.
Oh,
not practically.
I got to see that. That's like, there's like in the Torah, if you're a farmer or you're a shepherd. So this is a farmer or a carpenter. Okay. Who haven't we heard from? Laura?
Thank you. I'm Laura Baumgartner, and I'm also in Seattle. I am privileged to work with Deirdre and Jessica on the Earth Ministry Board, and I'm also a pastor at a Christian congregation that has a garden, and I have a garden in my yard. So I'm so thankful to get to learn about the Shmita and Shmita values from all of you. Thank you.
Terrific. Have we not heard? Is there anyone we haven't heard from yet? Okay, I think we'll move forward. So thanks everybody. It's nice to hear everyone's voices and a little bit of where you're coming from. So you'll forgive me. I think in interest of time, I'm gonna, read some of these texts, whereas my preference would be to really share and to hear one another's voices, but in order to make things go more smoothly. So what we're going to do is, with the time that we have, is we're going to use some texts as kind of a grounding and jumping off point for the topic at hand, which is, as I tried to describe in the workshop, really beginning to think in somewhat practical terms about how some of the principles, themes, underlying theology of the institution of Shmita might inform our practice and behavior today. If we're gardeners, maybe informing how we relate to the land as gardeners or stewards during the Shmita year, but also, as I mentioned earlier, I think quite easy to imagine how we could expand once we've identified the underlying values, how that might expand or extend beyond an agricultural setting. So we're going to be grounded in text, but then I hope that we can also begin to think about, at least begin a conversation that you can take beyond this workshop and discuss with friends in your community. Does that sound good? All right, so if you have questions, thoughts, use any of the tools at your disposal here on Zoom with raising your hand, and we'll make sure that we set aside, some different moments to open it up for questions. But if you have something that's burning, you can raise your hand, throw it in the chat. And I've asked Deirdre Melanie to put in the chat the source sheet that I'm going to be referring to. So if you folks could do that now, and I'm hoping that everybody has, we'll also read them out loud, but if folks want to hit the link on the chat, you can follow along the texts. We're not going to go through all these texts probably, but they're resources that you can have. All right, let's do it. So one more word by way of, I guess, introduction or orientation. As Deirdre mentioned in your really nice introduction, Deirdre, Shmita, there are a number of different facets of Shmita, which are all connected, of course, but there are a number of different dimensions, and we couldn't do justice to all of them, that's for sure. It's worthy of a lifetime of study and investigation, and certainly be worthy during the sabbatical year, in anticipation of the sabbatical year, which starts Rosh Hashanah, right? Rosh Hashanah is when the Shemitah year begins. And during the Shemitah year to really explore all the different facets. But for today, we're really going to focus specifically on the topic of growing food, and more specifically kind of how we relate to food during the sabbatical year is where we'll draw our attention. And I think it'll be interesting. I hope it is. All right. So as our starting off text, we're going to look at a text that may be the most familiar of the texts that we look at today for many of you, which is one of the places that the sabbatical year is described in the Torah itself. And it's mentioned in a number of different places. In each of the settings that it's described, some other facet of the sabbatical year is focused on or further elaborated on. So here we read, "The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assigned to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall reap the aftergrowth of your harvest," in Hebrew, sefiach, "and gather the grapes. I'm sorry, you shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. Shabbat haaretz lachem, la'ochla." So Shabbat haaretz, this Shabbat produce, you can eat, you, your male and female slaves, hired and bound laborers who live with you, your cattle and beasts in the land, meaning wild animals, may eat all of its yield. You shall observe my laws and faithfully keep my rules, that you may live upon the land in security. And the land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill. And you shall live upon it in security. And should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year, if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops? I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. I'm going to skip a few verses. Verse 23, "But the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. Throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for redemption of the land." All right, I'm going to read that part again. So the land must not be sold beyond reclaim. Lo timcher litz mitut ki li haaretz. The land must not be sold in perpetuity. Ki li haaretz, because the land is mine. You are ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are but strangers with me. Okay, so that is kind of our core text for all of the other commentary that we're going to explore together. We'll take just one moment here to see if there's any questions or observations. Any brief questions from that text, just to throw out. We won't necessarily answer them, but you want to voice.
What happened to the people during that year in terms of food?
Great. What do you eat? Right. Yeah. The text says, I kind of glossed over it quickly. The text says, does address it a little bit. It says, if you're to ask your question, Jackie, what are you going to eat? I'm going to give you, I being God, going to give you a blessing, double yield in the 6th year. But the question is still a good question. What are you going to eat? Other
It's kind of
questions?
Mana.
Great. Great. So that's great for those folks who are familiar. For many people, that probably jumps out. And you'll see, I think, elsewhere in some of the text, Jackie, that there is a connection between sabbatical year produce and mana. Any other questions or thoughts? Hello? Did I freeze?
No.
Yes. Okay. All right. So what I want to do now is look at a couple of Rashi's commentaries on a couple of the verses that we just read, where he really brings out some of the theology that may be taken for granted by the biblical authors, but may be potentially lost upon contemporary readers, and also helps, I think, spell out some potential obscurity in the text. So he says on the verse, it says, you shall not reap, you shall not harvest it. And here the verb liktzor, specifically in the Torah, has to do with grain. We know that the biblical diet was largely grain-based, and that's the reference here. So you shall not harvest it. And what he says is, what does that mean? It means you can't take it as your exclusive property, as you do with other harvests in another year, but it shall be free, or hefker. So that's one of our key words, or the key word maybe in this whole workshop, is hey, fe, kuf, reish, hefker, which is translated here as free for all. It's translated sometimes as ownerless, or communal. And all property in the sabbatical year, we can say that it has the status of being ownerless or communal. So what he's saying is you can't harvest it in a typical way. All right, we'll come back to that. Let's look at these three and then I'll pause for any comments. With respect to the next verb in that verse, that where it's saying you cannot gather, I think the reference is grapes. This verb is, in Hebrew, it's cool. We don't just have one word, harvest, but there's a lot of different verbs that are specific to the kinds of crops that are being harvested. So this one's saying you can't, Rashi's saying, where the verse says you can't harvest grapes of untrimmed vines, here it's saying you can't amass them. You must gather from that which has been declared, again, hefker, free to everybody. So again, there's this sense that, okay, maybe you can harvest it. It doesn't mean that you can't eat it at all, but you can't treat it in the standard way that you would the other 6 years. All right, still lots of questions probably that we need to answer. And finally, he says, what is this business of the Shabbat produce that you can eat, right? The text says what you can eat, and then it says what you can eat. And Rashi says, although I've forbidden them, the fruits of the sabbatical year, to you by stating you shall not harvest, I don't mean to forbid them to you as food but all must be equal as regards it, you and your hired servant and your sojourner. So he's actually saying that it's actually the Shabbat produce is in fact everything else, the grain and the fruit. It's just that you need to relate to it differently, needs to be equally available to everyone. Okay. Any questions? Deirdre.
But you're still not allowed to like till the soil, right? So there is an aspect. It's not like you're farming just like a regular year, but then you can't harvest it. Isn't there some aspect of not tilling?
Yeah, you can't do. I didn't include those verses, and I'm yes, absolutely. You cannot conduct almost any of your regular agricultural activity. So the assumptions in these two crops, these are perennial crops, and we'll focus on that, Deirdre, that you may not do any tilling, plowing, seeding. That is a given. The focus here is on harvesting, crops which are growing of their own accord. They have been planted prior to the sabbatical year, and they're perennial crops. You can't, one of the basic principles is you can't do anything to improve or, the land during that year. In the case of perennial crops, you can do the minimum amount of pay them of attention or labor in order to not those crops aren't destroyed, and negative consequences, but you can't plant. All right, any other questions or observations from Rashi's comments here in the way he's understanding these texts? This is one of the basic ideas. If we look at the next text in the Talmud, on text number 5, lest it not be entirely clear, Rabbi Abahu, a student came to Rabbi Abahu and said, what is the reason for the sabbatical year? And he very succinctly said, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to the Jewish people, sow for 6 years and withhold sowing during the 7th year so that you will know that the land is mine. Ki li haaretz. So here, the subtle move is, whereas the Torah describes it maybe as descriptive, as like the Talmud here, Rabbi Abahu is saying that is actually the prescription. That is the medicine of Shmita. The reason you do it is that we know that humans, when you're farming, relate to the land as landowners, as farming is by its nature like an act of God. It is a highly manipulative act. There's nothing natural about farming, you could say, right? Shmita comes to ensure or to try to correct for the susceptibility to the Israelite farmer, to the Jewish farmer relating to the land as the ultimate controller and owner. All right, so already I want to, just to name right here, like how this is the big takeaway is that I want us to reflect on is as gardeners, but also as not as gardeners, as just people who have stuff that we relate to as our own, material resources, natural resources. What might it mean to, in some way, relate to our stuff differently in the 7th year, right? Based on the Bible and the rabbis take it for granted that there's no such thing as complete ownership over the earth, right? That it's you're a steward temporarily. And that's what Shmita is about, is reminding, resetting in some fashion. And what might we do as gardeners and as people to, it's a profoundly radical thing, right? And I would assert that the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, is probably the most radical thing that we have in the entire Torah. Maybe the Jubilee year, which is after 7 cycles of the Shemitah, is the most radical. That idea, after 7 years of 7, all land goes back to the original landholders. So there's a radical redistribution of wealth that there can't be a infinite accumulation of wealth that a family can accumulate. But after 50 years, there's a reset. All right. I want to get a little bit more information under that we're all on the same page, and then have more of a conversation about some of the creative and possibly practical or impractical ideas that we might consider just as a starting off point. All right, so I want to look now at some texts that I hope are interesting to you. from the Tosefta. So the Tosefta is kind of contemporaneous with the Mishnah, the earliest strata of rabbinic teachings, collected oral teachings that were gathered together around the year 200 CE. So this is the earliest rabbis are taking the little bit of information that's in the Torah about the sabbatical year and asking the kinds of questions that we would ask, like how do you really put this to practice? What Jackie asked, what are people eating, and like what's the choreography? What's the mechanics and how to of putting in this practice? The Torah famously, speaks in kind of generalities, but doesn't, if we want to put something as big as Shmita into practice, there's long lists of questions and the rabbis entertain all of them. So I want to dive in. So Zeri, are you able to, I'm getting tired of my voice here. Zeri, are you able to read text number 6, do you have access to that?
I do, but the Tosefta?
Yeah.
Sure. I just don't see it as number 6.
I'm sorry.
Number 1?
Number 1, 6-1, yeah.
Okay. Initially, agents of the court would sit at the gates of the city. Everyone who brought, hold on one second. Something just popped up on my screen. Everyone who brought fruits in his hand would have the fruits removed and be given enough food for 3 meals in exchange. The rest would be entered into the storehouse.
Okay, so here the idea is that during the sabbatical year, when the fruits become ripe, those fruits, I'm Jacob, farmer, I have a pomegranate tree, right? And when the pomegranates are ripe, that I would bring the fruit, or somehow the fruit I would bring them to the agents of the court, shluchei beit din, and in exchange, I would be given like just enough food for like that day, basically. And again, whoever referenced the manna, right? You remember that like the Israelites, right? A deep part of the teaching was like you couldn't collect more than what you needed for that day, understood as a test of faith, and not wanting to hoard and be gluttonous. So too we have here. Let's Zara, would you continue and read
Sure.
the two?
Sure. When it came time for dates, the agents of the court would hire workers to gather them together, make them into pressed cakes, and enter them into the storehouse of the city. When it came time for grapes, agents of the court would hire workers, squeeze the grapes, press them, enter them into jugs, and place them in the city storehouse. When it came time for olives, agents of the court would hire workers to prepare and press them in the oil press, and enter the oil into jugs and place them in the city storehouses. These products would be distributed on the eve of Shabbat, every person according to the needs of his household.
Okay, so just a little bit more color here. Like each crop, right? The crops in the land of Israel, these perennial crops aren't all ripening at the same time. So it happened in sequence as the crops are harvesting. Again, there would be these court employees who would take these crops and then they would be collectively turned into value added, right? And then live in this communal storehouse and distributed to people equally or according to their needs over the course of the sabbatical year. All right, let's read one more and then see if there's any questions.
Someone who has fruit from Shavi'it, Shmita, when the hour for biur, removal, arrives, distributes the fruits to neighbors and relatives and people they know. They then go out and place the fruits on their doorstep and says, "My brethren from the house of Israel, anyone who needs may come and take." They then return and enter back into their house and eat until they are gone.
Okay, so here's seemingly a different mechanism or a different idea, that it's the concept of again, the language here is biur, and some of you will be familiar with the idea of biur. We're not that far away from Pesach, right? Removal, that we do remove leaven from our houses, right, in advance of Pesach. And here, during the sabbatical year, you do a biur that, and we'll have a little bit more of an understanding of that later, but I'll just fill in now that essentially, if I have a date tree, I can only bring dates into my house, those dates, and keep them in my house as long as there are still dates outside that are available to everybody, right? As soon as there are no longer dates available to the general public, I can't have them inside my house, because we've already learned that there needs to be equal access, right, for everybody. So here there's a ritual that's described where at the time of when biur is necessary, removal is necessary, because the implication is it's not available to everybody else. I have to bring them outside and put them, like, make it in a public area and announce that everybody has access to them. All right, let me pause there for a second. What any questions, observations? What seems to be the underlying principles or motivations here?
I love this, actually. I hadn't read these texts before, and there is an equalization that basically everybody's needs get met, that nobody necessarily needs to have an overabundance if other people have less. So it's a really wonderful concept of equal distribution.
Right. Right. And it's an interesting clause there, according to one's needs. There isn't the assumption that everybody, needs the same amount. Some families are larger. Maybe someone needs more calories, like according to the needs of their household. Great. Deirdre, did I see your hand?
Oh, I think it's also really, it makes me feel like this is a year when everybody goes to the food bank for food, that there's no grocery stores. So imagine what it would be like, if everyone needed to use it, that maybe they would be, well organized. And anyway, it just seems like it would promote an awareness and attention to food banks among the general population.
That's a very interesting insight. I love that. And as someone, our farm has a deep relationship. We're a partner with the city's food bank, and the farm is right next to the food bank. That's a powerful image. I think lots of implications to that, of course, and breaking down the potentially, at least for that year, with implications beyond of the taboo and of going, to a storehouse to receive food. Okay. Forgive me, I don't know if you're Colin or Garrett.
No worries, I'm Colin. So another thought that I had looking at this fourth piece, sort of a parallel to a different part of the holiday cycle, thinking about Purim, and we have kind of the two ways of distribution on Purim, Mishloach Manot and gifts of food for the poor, with one sort of reinforcing those strong bonds in our lives, the relationships that we already have, and then the other kind of reinforcing those weaker, looser communal bonds, the things that we owe to people that we might not even know, but are part of our community. And it's just really cool to see the parallel of those same two things in the Tosefta here.
I love that. That is just beautiful. Jackie.
I did have a question. It seems that there's two different systems that can be employed, and he covers both of them. One is through the courts and through the people who the courts run it. They organize the food that ends up in the storeroom and then the distribution of it. And then the last piece seems to be more relating to the individual.
Right.
Where the individual gathers what they need and leaves it on their doorstep or distributes that, but it's up to the goodness of the individual. and as opposed to doing it through the court system. And I just wonder, there must be a lot of discussion. There just seems to be a lot of ambiguities in these writings that can lead to a lot of rabbinical discussion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I won't speak to that much more now, but yeah, I think, you know, what we see in these early texts, just the beginning of trying to understand how to implement these teachings, and you know, generations of additional explanation. I want to just briefly, we're not going to be able to look at all these texts. I want to just briefly mention one or two other points before kind of open it up a little bit. So the next number of texts that I bring are from the Rambam, from the Mishnah Torah, where he has the laws of the sabbatical year. It's a very interesting read. If you get your hands on it. And in this next text, there's, you know, a very powerful image where he says that's a positive commandment for during the sabbatical year to annul ownership of anything that comes out of the ground, right? Again, to make it mafkir, to make it hefker, communal or ownerless. And then he includes this image that anyone who locks up their vineyard or fences has violated a positive commandment, right? And similarly, someone who harvests all the fruits and brings them inside. So what this text, well, first of all, it's a powerful image that the farmer has to literally take down their fences, right? And not just for people, but for animals, right? The legislation in the Torah includes animals, wild animals, chayot, as needing to have equal access to people. So literally taking down the fences. But I also want to just point out that what the Rambam is stressing is that you can't fulfill the obligation by being passive. And I think this speaks a little bit to your question, Jackie. You can't just be, okay, you know, like, I'll say it's ownerless, you know, like on Pesach, you know, you sell your chametz, you know, through some kind of symbolic gesture to a non-Jew. That doesn't cut it for Shmita. You have to go out of your way to actively fulfill this, right? You can't just say, keep everything in your house and say, you know what, anyone can come get it. You have to do something to make other people make it easy for them. And I would go further, and this is one of the big principles that informs our farm, Abundance Farm, the farm that I direct, is how do you create a culture or an environment where other people, or in this case, animals as well, are going to actually take advantage of it, and their experience of it is not getting a handout or taking something that is someone else's, right? It's a big thing, right? So saying, you know, how can you, Jackie, create a situation where during the sabbatical year as a gardener farmer, where other people can have access to the food in your garden and not feel like they are stealing or something sketchy about it, where they're taking food that's not really theirs. That the spirit of this whole thing is it's actually theirs as much as it is yours, even if it's on your front lawn. And that's a profound thing to think about.
Or maybe it's nobody's.
It's nobody's, it's everybody's.
It's everybody's.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You can translate hefker is the negative or the positive, right? It's ownerless or it's communal, right? And maybe there's something to think about there. So I think it's sad for me that we can't go much further here. But I want to say a couple of a couple of last, just name the principles that we've gotten to and some that we haven't got to yet. And then leave our remaining, 7 or so minutes. And I'm happy to stay on for longer for folks who have the time and interest to have a more informal conversation. So these, I've identified 7 basic principles that I think these texts illustrate that might inform our contemporary practice. They kind of overlap. One is there's no private ownership claims. Everything is hefker, right? Ownership, ownerless or communal. 2 is that how you harvest things needs to be different and informed by that principle. How you relate to produce, right? Whether it comes into your house, how long you keep it, and so on. There's no hoarding, right? You can only take as much as you need for that meal, right? Or that day. The third is the mechanics of or removal. You can only have things as long as others have access. So if there's tomatoes, I'm growing tomatoes, I can only harvest tomatoes and take tomatoes into my house as long as there's still tomatoes outside that other people can have, right? I can't harvest all the tomatoes or lots of tomatoes and start making sauce. 4 is it needs to be an active and not passive thing on the part of the farmer gardener. 5 we didn't get to, but the question of diet, that the diet is imagined to be perennials and wild vegetables, right? Not annuals. And the rabbis actually make even more restrictive legislation than what's described in the Torah, where the Torah says you can eat, for the gardeners among us, what we would call volunteers, things that have gone to seed and of their own accord emerge the next year, or biennial crops like parsley or kale, where you can overwinter and come up the next year. Whereas the Torah says that's okay, the rabbis say it's not okay, because they feel like it's kind of a fence kind of a thing, where those are crops that's more likely that the landowner is going to not share. So the diet is imagined to be perennial crops and wild vegetables. 6th, again, we didn't look at this text, it needs to be ripe. You can't harvest something before it's ripe. And all of these have to do with the principle that food is not meant to be a commodity in the sabbatical year. That food is food. You can't sell sabbatical year produce, transfer it to money and buy non-food items with it. It's not a commodity. It's not a resource. It's not abstract. It is meant to just be appreciated for what it is when it is fully ripe and ready to be used, right? You can't store it. You just eat it. So with all of that in mind, I think, again, potential more literal application, and then abstracted application with these principles, how we might invite them into our lives. And I'm going to mention, well, I'll stop there. Any reflections, ideas of what that might look like, the kernel of a thought in our lives?
I just wonder how the rabbis had such reflections on Shmita when none of them were farmers.
Many of them were farmers.
Were they?
Yeah, sure. Fair question. And I mean, many of the later commentators were not farmers. But these texts developed, in a time when there's an agricultural context, and many of the early rabbis were, if they were not themselves farmers, were still pretty intimate with agricultural economy.
Fair.
Yeah, but the point's well taken, and certainly for many hundreds of years, rabbis have been poring over these texts and yeshivot, trying to make sense of them, and far from an agricultural setting.
Well,
anyone?
Me,
Yeah.
I think, to me, it seems like one way to make it easier would be to have an emphasis on perennial crops. If you're less dependent and you're planting on perennials than on annuals, then you can, if we lived in a perennial, the Garden of Eden was a food forest, essentially. And it seems like one way to get to do this would be to have more food forest, perennial, local produce growing around us.
Yeah.
I wonder about that.
Yeah, I think that what your point, Deirdre, I'll just make reference of a text we're not going to look at together, but my good friend Yigal, a little excerpt from Envisioning Sabbatical Culture, makes the point that's very, very important, that the Shmita is not a practice that you can just wake up on Rosh Hashanah on the sabbatical year and observe. That the Shmita, as Deirdre said from the outset, is part of a 7-year cycle. And I think the only way to imagine, and the rabbis imagined it as a 7-year cycle. And while they didn't get into it, unfortunately, I would say, make explicit in the Torah, the strategic plan for what years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 look like. Certainly, there's no way that society could thrive and observe a year Shabbat together without preparing for it for 6 years. If you think about what you have to do on Thursday or Friday in order to just be able to have a Shabbat for 25 hours, what if you were to have a year, of Shabbat? And among the things that a society would have to do in order to have food is, I would tend to agree with Deirdre, is moving more to investing more in perennial food crops. And I would add to that, Deirdre, and I think actually part of the goal of perhaps part of the wisdom of Shmita is to ensure that people stay connected to our gathering roots, our pre-farm roots, right? Eden, you mentioned Eden. And as we know, and anyone who's familiar with the Torah knows that the Torah, the move to agriculture is a concession and not seen as something that is super positive, right? That the ideal in the Torah is in Eden is a pre-agriculture, is a gathering of perennial crops. And I think that one way to think about Shmita is preserving that wisdom and that relationship to the natural world. So
Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Abundance Farm? I would really love to hear what you guys are doing out there.
Sure. Well, we kind of observe a kind of Shmita every day of the year, every year, in the sense that everything that we grow is hefker all the time. So that was one of the basic principles that we found at the farm around. And literally everything that we grow, anyone can come and pick at any time. So with having said that, we're still in a, we're some of the other things that we're doing is we're not planting any new we're doing a minimal amount of new of agricultural work. Like we're not gonna plant new perennials during the Shmita year. And we are trying to think about, I guess, how we could further our goal of the entire community, as I was mentioning earlier, really experiencing the resources on our farm as not handouts or visitors to someone else's land, but as something that they really have equal ownership over. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy thing. But we've made some strides over, in that direction over the last 7 years. And I think that's really a focal point for how we can further develop that. And one example I'll just mention, one of many, is that most of the folks who harvest the food are food insecure in our city, and we've developed a committee of clients or people who are themselves participants in the Pick Your Own program, who this year are helping to direct and steward the program. So, they've been involved, folks have been involved in different ways, but this is the most kind of formal structure where we're trying to empower participants to help improve the experience. Again, in the interest of it being a more dignified experience.